prenatal, what's going on while the baby's still in the womb? What are the possible extrinsic factors that could be playing a role in the development that we see there while they interact with our genetic makeup that's driving most of the development? All right, and then postnatally then, we want to look at what happens with the systems, what do we see, what's typical, all right? Overall, we mentioned briefly on Wednesday that overall growth shows an S-shaped pattern. So if I look at a big picture, all right, if we make a very kind of cartoon version of a growth curve, all right, then can you see that on the camera column?
Yep.
Okay, here's time, here's growth, all right, so here's naught. We get, for the first year, crazy rapid growth, okay, and the second year almost as crazy. So we're going to have very steep for the first 2 years, right? And then we continue. Obviously, we're not the same height at 10 as we are at 2. So, but between 2 and going into puberty, that growth is much more steady. All right, so it goes upwards, but we see it be a lot less steep. And then we hit puberty, and everything goes kaplooey, right? So we have another rapid growth. It's not quite as steep as the initial one, but versus anything else we see during our lives, it's pretty quick, right? What goes on during puberty. And then once we reach maturity in the system, we should level out. Okay. So this timing, this initial one, you're going to see a lot of growth in any typical baby, right? Quite how much, obviously, is going to depend upon a lot of the genetics, how well nourished this baby is, right? How well cared for. This one occurs at puberty, and I can't put an age on that because that's highly individual, right? For girls, it's going to be anywhere, could go as young as 8, but the usual range is anywhere from 9 to 11, 12. Could be as late as 16. For boys, generally, somewhere between 11 to 13 or 14, right, on average. You've always got outliers that don't meet the typical picture, but, all right. So, big picture, kind of a funny looking S, because I'm not very good at drawing. So then if we're talking about height, and we're looking at growth curves, then the start, as I say, on average somewhere around 9 or 10, when girls hit puberty. And they're going to start growing. The speed of height, change in height, increases just a little bit before they start puberty normally. So somewhere around 9, we're going to start to see some slightly bigger changes in their height. And they hit what we call peak height velocity between 11.5 and 12. So that's the point in time during the growth spurt where they're growing the fastest. Velocity is change over time. Right? So not the point at which they're their tallest, but the point at which they're growing the quickest. Okay. And then for girls, again, on average, growth, so the speed of change in height starts to taper off around 14. They slow down quite a lot, and generally girls have finished growing around 16 on average. Right? Again, we probably all know. I know my younger sister didn't really stop growing in height till she was 18 or 19, right? But she also went into puberty very late. So we see a shift in the curve in time. For boys, that peak height velocity, somewhere around 13.5 to 14, so the point at which they're growing the quickest in height. And if you think about if you have brothers or cousins, or even if you can remember back to your classmates in school, boys' change in height is really dramatic during puberty, right? So they are quite affected when we start thinking of change in height as a structural constraint. So the difference in this age, boys taper off somewhere around 18, finish around 18. Again, it's an average. Not everybody's going to finish at 18. Some are going to go into their early 20s. So you may know people you're in college with right now who are half an inch taller in year 3 than they were when you guys started in year 1, maybe. Okay. So we've got people on either end of the spectrum. So one of the reasons that on average males are taller than females is because they get to grow for longer. Right? Their change in their height is going on for quite a few more years than it does for girls. So the bone structure, bone as a tissue, is exactly the same in men as it is in women. The reason the guys are taller is because they get to put more bone on for a few more years. Right? All right, so this S-curve is called a distance curve, right? It shows the extent, how much did someone grow. Right? The other way we can plot this is a velocity curve. And velocity curves are good because if I look at this, I can't see where this peak height velocity is. So when I look at a distance curve, there's no way of identifying the point in time they were growing the quickest within this curve. Right? But if I plot it as a velocity curve, now I've got the opportunity to see, oh yeah, my daughter was growing at her fastest when she was 11 years old, right? That's why I haven't had to buy her so many new clothes in the last year than I did last year, because last year she was growing like a weed, and this year we're slowing down a little bit, right? So I don't have to keep buying her new clothes. So on a velocity curve, then got to pay attention when I'm coming down on a velocity curve. Doesn't mean, obviously, that I'm shrinking, right? Just means that my change in height, the speed at which I'm changing is slower. When we hit a change in direction, then we're changing from slower to faster or faster to slower. So on a velocity curve, this first corner is called the age of takeoff. It's the point at which they start sprouting. Okay? So all of a sudden overnight, it's like the kids in your class go from 3 foot high to 6 foot high. And here's our peak height velocity, the point at which they're growing fastest. and then after peak height velocity, we're slowing down. We're still growing, but it's a lot slower. You don't see the change is not so dramatic. If you work with this age group, if you're going to teach PE to children who could go through puberty, this isn't really quite important point to be paying attention to, because everybody in your class is going to be doing this at a different time. Some people are going to suddenly shoot up and others are going to be still looking like they were in the previous year. Right? And how are you going to allow for this in your PE class? Because this is a major structural change. For your brain, this messes up all the movement patterns it spent the past 5 years learning. Because all of a sudden your center of gravity is not where it learned to balance, because you grew. Your arms that it was able to control are now 3 inches longer, right? So they weigh a ton more, because bone is heavy, and at some point you're going to add muscle to the bone, so now they weigh more. The center of mass for my arm is further away than it was before. So in order to move my arm, I have to change the force application. And to control my arm, or my legs, or my whole body, your brain has to totally change what it's learned. Right? So we often, and again, particularly for boys, because the change in the growth spurt is so much bigger for boys on average than it is for girls. Right? What we often see is that someone who did a skill very well now can't do the skill or can't complete it successfully anymore. Or they become real clumsy. Like mums get very frustrated during puberty, right? Because their young lad, their darling of their eye, is going around the house breaking everything. Because every time he turns around, there's all this body flying around that he can't control now, and he keeps breaking stuff, right? Reaches for a cup, but his arm's longer than how he learned to reach. So instead of picking the cup up, he knocks the cup over. So it can be a very frustrating time, particularly if you're a competitive athlete. So in my sport, right, in gymnastics, this plays a huge role, because we start, not we now because I don't coach anymore, but you start training competitive gymnasts very young, way before puberty, rightly or wrongly, right? That's the culture. And so I've got a whole slew of kids who are super, super talented and skilled, and then all of a sudden they grow 3 inches. Or try swinging a giant circle around the bar 3 inches longer than you were 2 months ago. Right? Everything goes wrong in that sport during puberty. Right? So some of you are in sports where you don't really start training hard or maybe even doing certain skills until this has already happened. So the impact might be less. Right? So it depends. What kind of event, what kind of sport are you going to coach, or are you going to be a PE teacher, or are you going to work at a recreation center? If you work at a rec center, you're going to see this going on, because they try to cater for a wide range of ages. Think about our constraints triangle. If I change a constraint, then the interaction of the constraints means I'm going to see a different movement pattern emerge. So what's likely to happen during this period in time? or if I have someone come back over the summer and all of a sudden they're doing something that's completely different. Is this a reason why? Does it change how I try to teach that skill to them? So weight also follows a typical S-pattern curve, okay? But weight is interesting because height is pretty fixed by your genetics. Something very dramatic has to happen to knock a child off their height growth curve. It's got to be really dramatic. They've got to be severely undernourished, or they've got to be developmentally deprived in some way, you know, kept in a very small space, or something really dramatic, or they've got to be very, very sick, right? It's going to be massively dramatic to knock a kid off a height curve.
Can lifting weights at a young age start a kid's growth? No?
You've got to be careful with weights because, and we'll get to this in a minute, in chapter 5, because the bone is still growing, but it doesn't keep them short. It's like gymnastics. Gymnastics doesn't make people short. Short people are very good at gymnastics.
So it won't be hindering in growth, but it can lead to injury.
Yeah. And the injury could hinder growth, but it would have to be pretty bad.
Pretty detrimental.
Yeah. Yeah. General weightlifting or resistance work? No. No. Not unless you're doing it very badly. Can you hurt them? Yes. Can you change their growth pattern? No. You know, people always said that about ballerinas and skaters and gymnasts, you know, or well, all that pre-pubertal training made them small. No. They got picked out because parents, you know, in Russia, when kids came in for testing, the coaches aren't looking at the kids. They have people sitting in the corner of the room watching who's bringing the kids in. If a 6'2" person brings a kid in, that kid ain't getting on the team because they're not going to be any good to them in the long run. Right? They're going to get too tall. Tall gymnasts have a hard time. There are a few, but not very many. Mechanically, it's really hard to do gymnastics if you've got very, very long levers. So it just self-selects in the same way basketball, right? We don't say that, oh, basketball makes people tall. You never hear that, right? Because it doesn't. Tall people are good at basketball, right? So weight is a little different than height, because whilst weight should follow an S-curve, and there is some genetic underpinning to a person's change in weight and how and where they put on weight. You know, is it muscle mass? Is it fat mass? Some of that is determined genetically. A lot of what we see is in weight change is down to some lifestyle issues, particularly when we get up here. So again, if I'm looking at children, a weight curve looks relatively similar, right? They put on lots of weight during the first year, 18 months, okay? And let's see, a baby's what, 7.5 pounds on average at birth. Girls are 7, boys are 7.5. By year 1, they're 21 pounds. They triple their weight in 1 year. Right? None of us can triple our weight in 1 year. Possibly. We'd have to seriously try hard to triple our weight in a year, right? So this is still massive change on a weight curve. Then we see chugging along. They put on about 4 pounds a year, and then they hit puberty and it all goes crazy, right? Put on a ton of weight in a very short time. Part of that is skeleton. Part of it for girls is fat mass, part of it for boys is muscle mass, and then we get to adulthood. Now, Adults are interesting because genetically, I've finished growing. So there's no reason for my growth curve for weight not to flatline, right? But that's not generally what we see. What we see is something very silly going on, right, with the majority of people. So much more variability when we look at weight curves for individuals. Okay? In puberty, people grow up and then they grow outwards. So that's what we see. We see the change in height first, and then we see the weight coming on. Okay? So the peak weight velocity is generally several months behind. Right? If we're looking at particular limb segments, so if you're looking at an individual's arms or their legs, then their change in length can finish before they've finished growing in height, but you always see the change in length done before the weight goes on. That causes a problem because I put on a lot of weight, the bone gets a lot longer without the muscle mass to pick it up. Right? So we see a period in time where their strength seems to deteriorate. It's not really that their strength deteriorated, it's just their weight went up and they can't manage that extra bone mass without the additional muscle mass. So, S shape, right? Specific limbs, specific organs, different tissues all have their own growth timeline, right? Everything doesn't finish growing at the same time. And go back, have another look. We looked on Wednesday that proportional diagram on page 66 so that you can get a feel for the change in body proportion and how that could impact the mechanics that are going on. Right? If I have a lot of weight up here and I've got itty bitty tiny little feet, right? When children are trying to walk, their brain is trying to cope with insane, please put the phone away, insane mechanics. All right? So head is really big, base of support is really tiny. They've got very small feet at 1 year old. Not a problem as we look at teenagers and adults. So after peak height velocity, what goes on? Right, we finished growing in height, but we haven't finished growing in breadth. For boys, once their height velocity is starting to slow down, they are going to start to expand their shoulder girdle. Right? So their shoulder girdle goes through a growth spurt. Biacromial growth spurt. The acromion processes that lumpy bit on the end of your shoulder there. So we see a change in the width between the acromion processes on the left and right. Right? So that gives them more of a triangular, upside down triangle shape. And then they start to put on some muscle mass. So they get tall, skinny, and then they start to fill out, on average. Girls, we don't see such a big spurt here. Some girls will get a little bit of change in shoulder girdle width. Girls see a lot of change after their peak height velocity in biiliac spurt. So between the iliac crests on the hip bones, we see widening of the hips. So they'll get more of either an hourglass shape or a triangle shape, depending on how much change they see in their shoulders. Some girls see very little change in their shoulders, quite a lot of change in their hips, and they get very pear-shaped, right? Other girls get a more even balance and they're very hourglass. Guys generally don't see any change in their hips and they go upside down triangle. Okay. So all of those change your mechanics and they change what you can and can't do if you're going to work PE or skills with children who are post-pubertal. Because pre-pubertal, boys and girls are pretty similar. Right? They're about the same height, they're about the same weight, generally about the same strength. If I want to mix them all in, if I've got a mixed sex school, then I don't have to worry about splitting the boys and girls up for PE, right? Because they can all hold their own. Once we go past puberty though, now I've got a problem, because it depends what I want to teach and how I'm going to teach it as to whether or not I can mix the girls and the boys. Right? If I'm going to do chin-ups, I'm going to do fitness stuff, then the girls aren't going to meet the same standard the boys are because they don't have as much muscle mass in their upper body. Okay. Legs though, when we look at leg strength in girls relative to boys, they hold their own very well. So if I'm going to do lower leg work, the girls can keep up. Okay. If we're going to start doing throwing and we're going to have distances and targets, I can't expect the girls to make the same distance and target as the boys. So I have to have different expectations, different grading. I've got to allow for the difference that these changes in the skeleton make in the mechanics and the capability for the skill. Okay. So keep thinking about the constraints triangle. That's why I like it. That's why I use this book, because it really does help a lot with what you see once they've gone through here. The other thing you've got to watch with girls once they've passed puberty is this Q angle idea at the knee. Alright? Because what happens as the hip girdle gets wider, this Q angle gets deeper, which puts a lot of stress on the knee joint. So it's really a very interesting line of research. There is tons and tons of research out there on why girls have more knee injuries in professional sport than boys do. Right? Part of it is the Q angle. Part of it is menstrual cycle. There's all kinds of hypotheses around why we see so many more knee injuries. Girls, basketball, soccer, bad knee injuries compared to the guys. Right? And part of it is this. When they jump and land, what happens at their knee joint is very different to what you see happen in a guy's knee joint. Some of that is because their quads tend to be strong and their hamstrings are weaker. Some of it is this change in how the force is transmitted through the bone at that joint. Right, so way back at the beginning, we looked at terminology. We said growth is the quantitative change in size. Maturation is the qualitative change in function in a system. So we also, if we're going to teach movement, we have to understand when different systems are going to mature, because that might impact how I can teach a skill, or whether it's appropriate to teach a skill, right? So maturation rate also varies dramatically between individuals, right? Girls typically at any age until adulthood, at any age are physiologically more mature than the equivalent boy. Okay. So their systems tend to mature earlier, and so we go into puberty earlier than boys do. So size and maturity might be related, but they're not dependent upon each other. So just because someone is tall doesn't mean that they're aerobically or sexually mature. Right? I might have someone who's very small who is sexually mature in my class. Right? While I've got other people who aren't yet. So I can't make assumptions based on size and chronological age. Some systems are going to become more mature without growing bigger. Some systems have to grow bigger in order to become mature. So you've got to be careful of assuming things as you walk into a classroom and look at a group of individuals. Right? We have early versus late maturers. So someone who's an early maturer generally is going to go into puberty early and finish earlier. So they may be the tallest person in the class that year. But then when the rest of the class go into puberty, they catch up. I could have someone who's a late maturer goes into puberty very late, 15 or 16, they're going to be somewhat small compared to the rest of their classmates probably. And then they'll suddenly do their growth spurt later on and catch up or maybe even overtake the rest of their classmates. Okay. So think about, as you're looking at this chapter, there are some couple of questions embedded in the chapter to try to make you think about, if I'm the teacher, how do I talk to the parents of a child who's an early maturer and very good at school sport, right? They're on all their sport teams, they're the star, everybody loves them, you know, they're everybody's best friend because the star football player or the star basketball player has lots of friends, right? And then what happens? Does that mean they're going to be a professional sports star? Right? No, not necessarily, right? Because they're taller and bigger and stronger than everybody else their chronological age because they started early. Doesn't mean they're going to finish up ahead of everybody else. Okay? What do I do if I'm the parent of that child? How do I, you know, am I gonna tell them they're the star? Or am I going to try to point out to them that they're pretty good right now? Right? But that doesn't mean you don't have to work hard, and it doesn't mean that everybody else isn't going to be as good as you when you go back to school after the summer break. You've got to decide, how are you going to approach that? What kinds of variations are you going to see as a teacher with a preteen group of children? Who's developing secondary sexual characteristics, who isn't? How does that impact their confidence or their self-image? Does it make them more confident or less confident? Depends on the person. I can't judge ahead of time. I just have to be aware, keep my eyes open, and keep all the possibilities in my back pocket. right? A girl who starts to develop breast buds may get very, very self-conscious at getting changed for PE. So maybe she starts flunking PE. I don't know. Right? Here's a girl that always came to PE, never blew PE off, always brought her gear, she's always been great, and now all of a sudden she's bunking off. Right? So, even though we're postnatal, extrinsic factors can still play a role and have an impact, particularly during these two very rapid growth spurts that we see. All right? And so if we see some delay because of an extrinsic factor, then we can often see what we call catch-up growth after the event. So it could be maybe they got really sick, right? Or maybe they had an injury. And so the rest of their classmates are ahead. When they get better, typically what we see is catch-up, right? So for most individuals, after a period of delay, when whatever the negative influence is removed, they will go through a really quick little growth and they end up where they would have been anyway. Right? Catch-up growth. I'm going to end up where I would have been even though there was a bit of delay going on in the middle. Right? If the extrinsic influence, whatever the negative problem, is very extreme and it goes on for a very long time, that catch-up growth might not quite get them back to where they would have been if they hadn't had the problem. But generally it does. Right. So, we get through all of this. We get into here, we trundle along in our 20s and 30s and 40s, right? And what's going on as we get older, right? Height is typically stable. During adulthood, starts to decrease around 45, 50. You don't see very much change, but if you watch your grandparents, and between the ages of 65 and 75 or 80, they shrink quite a lot, right? It feels like you're still growing because you go to visit your grandparents and you're like, wait, what are they doing down there? How did that happen? Okay, I'm still wearing the same pair of jeans, how come, right? Nanny's getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, right? Because we do see some decrease in height, particularly with elderly individuals. Right? Some of that is compression of cartilage, pads in the spinal column. Right? The cartilage pads get squished and get thinner. Other connective tissues. At my age now, what I notice is I'm just ever so slightly taller in the morning than I am in the evening. When I get in my car in the morning, I'm often having to tweak the rear view mirror. And then on a day when I've been standing up and doing a lot, I get in the car in the evening to drive home and I have to tweak the mirror a little bit again. And you're like, that's a bit weird really, but you know, as you're standing, the compression just changes ever so slightly. And as you get older, that gets worse. The other thing could be osteoporosis. So loss of bone density. Okay? And if it's bad enough and you develop osteoporosis in your spine, you can actually see a total collapse of a vertebra. So obviously, you know, if a whole vertebra collapses and shatters, then I'm going to see quite a big drop in height due to that. Right? Or another one you get is they get weak in the shoulders, or they develop some osteoporosis in the upper back and around the neck, and we start to see this. So if I pick them up and straighten them out, I might not see as much change in height. But because they're starting to do this, we see an overall change in height, right? But it impacts whether it's a real or a kind of fake one. This changes the movement pattern you're going to see. Okay. Then if I do this, it's another really good reason to stay strong. If I look at weight, we said we start to see this silly stuff going on with weight. In general, on average, you guys are not average, remember? In general, when you leave high school and come to college or go to work, we see a gain in weight, right? So for some people, it's quite dramatic, like 20 odd pounds. For other people, it's just a very little bit because they continue to exercise. But some of that is, you know, mum's not doing the cooking anymore. Now all of a sudden I'm in charge of feeding myself. What do I choose to feed myself? Okay? Do we always make the best choices when we get that first little glimmer of independence, right? Mum wouldn't let me have ice cream every day, but she's not here now. I can do whatever I like, right? So some of that is lifestyle, diet and exercise. Right? When you get a full-time job and you have a family, it becomes very, very difficult to make time during the day to exercise properly. So that might be a cause, right? I still eat really well, but I stopped exercising because there's no time for it, right? I have to drop the kids off at school at 7 o'clock. I have to be in the office by 7:30. I get a 30-minute lunch break. I have to pick the kids up at 3:30, and I've got to have their dinner ready, and I've got to help them with their homework, and I have to get them into bed, and then I have to have a conversation with my partner in case we forget who the partner is, and before I know it, it's time for bed, and there wasn't any time to do any exercise in there. Right? So that also plays a role in why we see a weight curve not stabilized. As we get older, we might see a loss of muscle mass. So if I don't manage to maintain a physical activity program, if I don't keep walking, or I don't keep going to the gym or to the swimming pool, then as we get older, particularly again around 50, we start to see quite a big change in muscle mass. We start to lose fast twitch fibers, and if I don't exercise, then we can see quite a big change in weight due to losing muscle mass. So the older we get, the harder it is to predict what someone's weight is going to be, right? Because of all these other variables that play a role. Sometimes it's very easy to go, well, they're old. Right? They're old. They can do what they like. You know, why would we expect them to move? You know, if my grandmother is 90 years old, it's perfectly fine for her to sit in her chair all day and watch daytime TV. She's 90. She earned the right to do that. Right? The problem is that the drop in muscle mass can be very quick. Well, now, how easy is it for her to get up and down out of her chair? Right? How easy is it for her to go to the supermarket and get her food in? How easy is it for her to go down to the senior citizen centre and have some camaraderie and some socialisation with other people who are nearer her age? Right? All those things start to chip away at someone's quality of life. If I can't go shop for myself, now I'm not independent. That means either I have to rely on Meals on Wheels, or I have to rely on a family member who's already busy because they've got a job and a family, and now they have to come and look after me as well. That doesn't do very much for your self-esteem, right? What if I'm in my chair and it's too much effort to get out of my chair to go and get the sandwich that my daughter came and made me on her way to work this morning so that I had something to eat, right? But when she stopped in on her way back, the sandwich is still in the kitchen because I couldn't be bothered to get out of the chair. It was too much effort. Right? So it's not okay for us to go, well, you're 90, sit down. Don't do anything, it's okay. It's not okay, right? It's important for adults to maintain their independence for their quality of life. And to maintain independence, we have to maintain health and strength and balance and all the things that are involved in a movement person's life. Right? Over the course of your lifetime, the number of people who are 80 and 90 is going to be way more than it is now. Right? So as you get older, think about how many 90-year-olds you know now. When you get older, there's going to be a lot more 90-year-olds around. Right? What are we going to do with them? We don't even know what we can do with them because we don't have enough research on that age group. Right? What is safe? What is too much? What should I be encouraging them to do and what should I tell them to avoid? We don't even know. That's a big, big hole in the motor development, motor learning research spectrum. Okay, we've got this entire population down the other end down there that we barely know anything about. We've got to start looking out for. You guys are going to be that population if you're lucky. Right? If you stay healthy. So wouldn't it be nice, don't you think, when you get to 90, if there's all this stuff to do? Do we have to see a movement decline?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. We are going to see a decline. Does it have to be to a point where I have to be completely sedentary? Absolutely no. Right? I can delay the decline. I can maintain my independence, I can maintain my strength, I can maintain my balance, so I'm not scared of falling over every time I walk. If I'm not scared, I'm going to be a little more adventurous. I'd like to be this person when I'm 70. That would be pretty cool. Can we train? Can we maintain our physical activity levels so that we can maintain our independence? The research does show that even if we take a population who are physically quite frail, if we give them the appropriate exercise program, that we can see changes, we can see improvement in their balance, improvement in their strength. Okay. So the research is starting to show that we can do something to help. We need to know a lot more.
I gotta head to work.
That's okay, we're done.
Please,